Okay, students, now we're in part two of this folder where we talk about the socialist tradition of the 1920s and Mexican repatriation. We're going to take a look at World War I to the Great Depression. Now, what we've understood so far about the Arizona community is that Mexicans in Arizona had to adjust to the racialization process. They organized community celebrations respecting their heritage, and that's how we ended the last presentation. Because music, dance, and food were created for their delight. But struggles were always a part of their condition. So we're going to learn about what is known as the Bisbee deportation. Now, we need to appreciate something about the American immigrant working tradition. Back in Unit 1, I introduced you to the strong traditions that American workers were about in terms of organizing into unions. And they had a strong socialist tradition, the European immigrant worker, the American immigrant worker. And that tradition found fruition in the organizing efforts of one of the most important labor unions of the early 20th century. And that labor union was known as the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, the Wobblies. So we're going to visit a place called Bisbee, Arizona. And we're going to understand what happened when white workers attempted to unite with Mexican workers during World War I with the hope of creating racial equality. And most importantly, with the hope of eliminating the dual wage system, where whites and Mexicans would get paid the same wage. So let's appreciate what came to be known as the Bisbee deportation, and let's not be surprised at what Arizona is attempting to do today with regards to the Mexican experience. Let's go back to the film and understand something about the Bisbee deportation.
By 1915, a new union had entered Arizona. The International Workers of the World, better known as the Wobblies, were motivated by socialist ideals and dedicated to the overthrow of capitalism.
The IWW was looked upon as being a radical movement made up of unpatriotic Americans who were suspect of having communistic tendencies. The IWW wanted to represent the working class. The IWW wanted to represent the immigrant. And the IWW especially wanted to represent the Mexican immigrant.
The demand was that everyone be treated equally on the job. The men of the union were demanding that they be recognized and there be no discrimination against anyone because of race, religion, or national origin.
World War I brought the Mineros, the Wobblies, and the mining companies into a sharp confrontation. With the country at war, the demand for copper rose astronomically. In 2 years, the price of copper had jumped from 13 cents to 27 cents a pound. By 1917, Phelps Dodge reported a 218% increase in net profits. The workers saw none of this in their paychecks. On June 27, 1917, in nearby Bisbee, 4,000 workers demanded higher wages and an end to the dual wage system. Boasted by the support of large numbers of mineros, the Wobblies called a strike, war or no war. Walter Douglas, president of Phelps Dodge, had no patience for the demands.
Those who are not for us are against us. The strikers are getting further and further outside the citizens of this country who place devotion to flag above every other consideration. An infected sore may well become a cancer if it is not cut out. Walter Douglas.
Phelps Dodge quickly retaliated.
They put the story out that the miners tunneled underground, that they were German spies, and they were going to blow up the Bisbee post office. The mining company took over the telephone company, the Western Union. They put guards on all incoming and outgoing traffic. You could not come into Bisbee and you could not get word out without mining company permission.
Early on the morning of July 12, 1917, vigilantes armed by Phelps Dodge arrested 2,000 strikers. At gunpoint, the prisoners were marched into the downtown plaza. Those who pledged loyalty to the company were released. Everyone else was marched to the edge of town.
My father was operating a jitney service. That was a long-distance taxi and a local taxi, too. His customers, I assume, would have been mostly the miners. When they started running the people out of town, they came and got him early in the morning.
"1,200 prisoners were loaded into cattle cars of the El Paso and Southwestern Railroad, owned by Phelps Dodge. Packed 50 to a car, they were taken 200 miles to Columbus, New Mexico. They were dumped in the desert with no food or water and threatened with death if they returned to Bisbee. Phelps Dodge announced, "Any talk of their coming back is nonsense. They will not be allowed to come back. The serious business of this district is the mining of copper ore, not the building of nightly schools of anarchism." A year later, a commission appointed by President Woodrow Wilson condemned the Bisbee deportation as it came to be known. It was called a grave violation of the law and the Constitution. Unions would not return to Arizona for 25 years.
Well, all you got to do is get the public stirred up, and freedom is out the window. What is it? Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And if you're not eternally vigilant, you're going to lose your liberty. And the Mexicans didn't have any to begin with, and the rest of them didn't have much more, as a matter of fact.
Okay, as John Pintick says, that labor lawyer, and it is because of his research that we know about the Bisbee deportation. Talk about civil liberties being eliminated for war profiteering. He had mentioned, John Pintick had mentioned that get the public stirred up and freedom is out the window. And students, how many times have we experienced this in the past 10 years? John Pintick is going to refer to Thomas Jefferson talking about, because Thomas Jefferson wrote that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. If you are not eternally vigilant, you will lose your liberty. And what John Pintick said was very real. The Mexicans didn't have any, and the rest not much more. So what's going to happen, one of the curious things about the Bisbee deportation is that all these Mexicans and whites are going to be sent out to the desert and then dropped off along the border. And at gunpoint, the Mexicans are going to be sent across the border at Columbus, New Mexico. Now, it's going to take a while for the white workers to be deported back to the Appalachian Mountain states where they originated. And what's curious is that one of the things during the 1880s in the U.S. military's attempt to control the border from Apache peoples, because the Apaches used the border effectively to resist the economic penetration of their lands. They lived on both sides of the border. Was that the American military recruited black soldiers because the Apaches were fast runners and whites could not run as fast as them in the desert. So they recruited black soldiers because blacks could run fast, and perhaps they could capture Apache resistance leaders. And so they were called the Buffalo Soldiers. And one of the things is when you take a look at the picture there, is they were sending all of these whites and Mexicans and deported them out of Arizona, is that for the white workers to be deported back to the Appalachian Mountain states where they originated, Buffalo Soldiers that were stationed in El Paso, Texas, are going to be recruited out to New Mexico, and they're going to build a tent city for these white workers, and then they're going to cook for them while the white workers are being processed and sent back home. Now this is an amazing story, and I encourage all of you, if you ever have a chance to pass through Bisbee, go into their museum, because again, that labor lawyer, John Pintek, made sure that we would not forget about this particular experience. It is an amazing story. It's straight out of Arizona's racist legacy, and we should not be surprised at how Arizona right now is responding to Mexican immigrants. So let's revisit the National Origins Act of 1924. The reason the most controversial act concerning immigration is going to pass both houses of Congress was related to the turbulent white migration of populations to the United States. So I want you to remember, students, that the term alien refers to Europeans. It was first applied to Europeans, not Asians or Mexicans. But the National Origins Act of 1924 was influenced into law by the radicalism of white workers who wanted justice. When the 1920s began, the U.S. government is going to make sure that the industrial workers of the world was destroyed, the IWW. All radical immigrants are going to be deported. And the main leader of the Socialist Party, Eugene Debs, is going to be incarcerated. He will be in jail. Strikes by white workers are going to be beaten down by force. And so Congress in the 1920s is going to put an end to the dangerous and turbulent flood of immigrants by passing laws setting immigration quotas. And the quotas favored Anglo-Saxons. It kept out Africans and Asians. It limited the arrival of Italians, of Slavic peoples, and Jews. The English, the Protestant Irish, and the Germans were favored over Africans, Chinese, and Eastern and Southern Europeans. So the National Origins Act solidified the melting pot theory for white Americans. It ensured the three-generational process of assimilation, and immigration became a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant privilege as a result of the National Origins Act of 1924. And at the same time that the act was passed, the Ku Klux Klan began to boast that it was a national organization. And the Ku Klux Klan in 1924 boasted that it had 4.5 million members. And the warning sign to immigrants coming to America in the 1920s, which was known as the decade of the Roaring Twenties, or the Jazz Age, the warning sign said, "Only WASPs apply." But most importantly, the Origins Act did not include Mexicans. And because Mexicans were significant for the transformation of the Southwest into an industrial empire. Now, there were significant and powerful industrial and agricultural lobbyists in Congress who made sure that Mexicans would not be included in the National Origins Act of 1924. They encouraged Congress to allow Mexicans to enter any time. And the compromise was that they would have to pay a head tax to enter, thereby financing the creation of the Border Patrol. So students, I want you to read again, I want you to read that chapter that accompanies this unit. See, Mexicans were needed and Mexicans were recruited to build the infrastructure of the Southwest. The transportation industry, the mining industry, agriculture, and irrigation projects needed Mexican labor. And U.S. corporations had optimized their power in Congress in the 1920s. So labor forces are tied to U.S. interests, which necessitates movements of populations for the development of the United States Southwest and the Midwest. So take a look at the chapter and recognized that railroads, agriculture, mining, irrigation projects assured and perpetuated the need for Mexican labor. Now, throughout the first 3 decades of the 20th century, Mexicans are going to move into areas predominantly occupied by Mexicans. Mexicans are going to move into areas that are environmentally, geographically, and topographically similar to Mexico. And as they entered, they all experienced economic discrimination through a dual wage structure. And as their numbers grew, the treatment by the dominant society became heightened and alarmist. And most often, a hysteria surrounds American communities when numbers of perceived foreigners increase. And the mass media can stir up public opinion, which can influence legislation. So throughout the 1920s, debates occurred over what to do with the Mexican, just like debates are occurring today. And since the 1850s and increasingly around the turn of the 20th century, urban barrios became important centers of economic, political, and cultural activities. And so when the United States took over Mexico, American cities are going to be built around Mexican communities. And so please get to know that so that when you go to San Antonio, to El Paso, to Albuquerque, to Tucson, to San Jose, to San Francisco, to here in Los Angeles, that American cities are going to be built around the Mexican communities. So when that occurs, there's a social, psychological, and organizational cohesiveness that will occur within the Mexican communities. And Mexican immigrants, as they come into the United States, are naturally going to move into the barrios as well as create their own barrios. For instance, here in Los Angeles, when railroads had finally finished being connected from Texas over to California, Mexicans once the railroads were completed, they created their own camps for them to live in. And Watts and Compton were originally Mexican railroad camps. And during World War I, with the great migration of Southern blacks as they moved to the West, Southern blacks will move west and will enter Watts and Compton and move in with Mexicans in the railroad camps. So as railroad, agriculture, and mining interests, along with massive state-sponsored irrigation projects, as they expanded, they're going to assure and perpetuate the need for Mexican labor. And then as you read the chapter that's assigned for this unit, many Mexicans are going to find themselves moving to states like Iowa and Nebraska, Illinois and Michigan, where they will create their own enclaves. And they were recruited primarily because of World War I and the need for labor in the steel industry. So this urban barrio context is going to be dramatized in the 1920s and 1930s as sociologists become concerned with, quote-unquote, the Mexican problem. And the national legislation of the 20s and 30s reflected a tug-of-war between corporations needing labor forces and restrictionists, right-wing evangelical bigots and racists known as eugenicists, calling for Mexican deportation. And so this is what led to the creation of the Border Patrol under the Immigration Quota Act of 1924. Mexicans were not included in the act to be restricted, but they had to pay a head tax to enter. So throughout the 1920s, racists known as eugenicists kept lobbying Congress to extend restriction legislation to Mexicans, but they couldn't mount enough backing against the agricultural and industrial lobbyists to push a bill curbing Mexican migration. There was tremendous debates in the 1920s over what to do with the Mexican. But the power of agribusiness and the power of other industrialists employing Mexicans blocked the racists, blocked the cultural bigots, blocked the eugenicists. Let me just give you an example. I want to read from an argument presented by Representative James Nance Garner of Texas, who in 1927 is going to comfort the racists by informing them that Mexicans returned home after the picking season in South Texas. And he said in Congress, all they want is a month's labor in the United States, and that is enough to support them in Mexico for 6 months. They are a docile people. They can be imposed on. The sheriff can go out and make them do anything. So what's going to happen is by the eve of the Great Depression, the Mexican and the Chicanos' economic and political situation is going to worsen. And so new arguments are going to be advanced by the eugenicists. Well, there was widespread unemployment. There's the racial undesirability of the Mexican. There's the fact that the Mexican is just not American. And there was this one professor, a PhD, whose name was Roy L. Garris of Vanderbilt University, and he was authority on eugenics. And he's going to testify before Congress claiming that science can prove the Mexicans' inferiority. And what he did was he sent his graduate students to research and report on all major Mexican communities in the United States. And so these graduate students went to from San Antonio to Los Angeles. They went to Denver, Chicago, and Detroit. And they wrote dissertations on the Mexican communities. And this research became evidence at congressional hearings. So that when the Great Depression hit, Congress began to hear about the Mexican experience from these people. And here is what one PhD candidate wrote about my grandfather's community in El Paso, Texas. Now, mind you, he earned his doctorate writing the following about my dad's neighborhood. My dad's neighborhood is known as Segundo Barrio. That's why I put there Segundo Barrio, the Ellis Island of the South. This is where I'm from, in El Paso, Texas. But this is what he wrote about my dad's neighborhood and community. This is what was used as evidence in Congress to deport Mexicans. Their minds run to nothing higher than animal functions, eat, sleep, and sexual debauchery. In every huddle of Mexican shacks, one meets the same idleness, hordes of hungry dogs and filthy children with faces plastered with flies, disease, lice, human filth, stench, promiscuous fornication, bastardly, lounging, apathetic peons and lazy squaws, beans and dried chile, liquor, general squalor, and envy and hatred of the gringo. Yet there are Americans clamoring for more of this human swine to be brought over from Mexico. Again, great science, no, students? So these restrictionists are going to win their battle as the Send the Mexican Back to Mexico movement is going to inspire President Herbert Hoover. It was foreigners who were responsible for the Great Depression. It was foreigners who were responsible for the unemployment in white America. It was foreigners who were un-American. And so the favorite scapegoat of the Great Depression at the outset of the Great Depression was the presence of undocumented workers in the United States. So Mexicans are going to be the first to be blamed for America's ills. And Hoover's Secretary of Labor, William N. Doak, is going to request funds for the expansion of the Border Patrol and will encourage local authorities throughout the Southwest and Midwest to devise programs for the deportation of Mexicans. And Los Angeles will serve as the model repatriating city. So let's see what happened in the mining communities of Arizona. And this is just a microcosm of what happened in the larger part of the United States. And this was just Bisbee, Arizona. Clifton Morenci, Arizona, a small mining town in Arizona. But this is what happened throughout the United States. So let's go to that film clip.
Phelps Dodge was growing increasingly powerful. The company bought all of Arizona's leading newspapers. Telephone and telegraph systems were company controlled. Even town attitudes were dominated by the company.
A lot of the Anglos that were in high positions would take advantage of a lot of the Chicanos by pointing the finger at them or trying to make them feel inferior. I remember I was about 10 years old, and I was coming from the post office with one of my uncles. We were coming by, and this guy by the name of Pete Riley, who was a druggist right across the river. And he was driving a 29 Dodge. He slammed on the brakes because we tried to cross there and said, "You goddamn dirty Mexican, next time you do something like this, I'm gonna kick your ass up and down the railroad tracks." And that engraved in me for years and years and years.
For the next decade, the Mineros, isolated and powerless, could do little to improve their situation. But the worst was yet to come. In 1931, at the beginning of the Depression, the bottom dropped out of the copper market. Phelps Dodge closed down the mines. Of 3,000 formerly employed miners, only 42 had jobs. 8 million people across the United States were out of work. In the Southwest, Mexican Americans became scapegoats for the economic crises.
America's problems were due to the fact of the economy being in such a depressed state. America's problems were blamed on the immigrants themselves. And in this case, again, it was the Mexican.
The administration of President Herbert Hoover announced that strict enforcement of immigration laws would help solve the national unemployment problem. Mexicans, who had been encouraged to cross the border openly for decades, were the immediate target. The government moved swiftly to deport any Mexicans whose citizenship could be questioned. The program was called repatriation.
What started out perhaps as a very mannerly order turned out to be a total helter-skelter way of sending Mexicans back home. Mexicans were rounded up illegally. Mexicans were just shipped back. Many of these Mexicans were Americans. They were born in the United States. They were naturalized legally.
Los Mineros, who by now had deep roots in the U.S., were no longer wanted. Little distinction was made between those born in Mexico and those born in the United States. Some escaped being deported through pure luck.
My mother was expecting my youngest brother, Richard, and we were not able to get on that train. My youngest brother was born the next day, so that kept us from going back to Mexico.
Phelps Dodge assisted with the repatriation effort. They provided the trains to carry the Mineros away.
Most of them wouldn't argue because they knew they would suffer at the end. One way or other, they'd get a hold of them, you know, where they would make them wish they had gone.
There's nothing I could do. I just took those people around the border of Mexico. The PD and the Red Cross was paying me for that. And they gave me some money to give those people when I unload everything they had. All I had to do, unload trunks or boxes, whatever they had.
It's something that it's really hard to describe because it hurts you. It hurt me, and I didn't have to go. But my friends, the young buddies that had to go, they put them on that train, and God only knows.
By By the time the repatriation program ended, more than 500,000 people of Mexican descent were deported to Mexico. Half the population of Clifton Morenci was gone.
Okay, student, let's remember the national character and its attitude towards Mexicans. It's not just Arizona, but it's the entire country. And remember, it's the white beans, the black beans, the yellow beans, the red beans in this era. In the 1930s, they viewed the Mexicans, the brown beans, as problematic. So let's understand the cycles of change in immigration policy here, and this is the key here. And you need to appreciate this, please. The patterns of immigration history reveals the cycles of change that will continue to the present day. So please understand this, students. Whenever there are economic labor necessities in the United States, the remedy becomes Mexican migration, which stimulates a movement of people to the United States. And when the labor needs are satisfied, there oftentimes occurs an economic downturn, which results in immigration restriction and deportation. So let me share with you one more time that the patterns of immigration history reveal the cycles of change. Whenever there are economic labor necessities in the United States, the remedy becomes Mexican migration, which stimulates a movement of people to the United States. When the labor needs are satisfied, there oftentimes occurs an economic downturn, which results in immigration restriction and deportation. So this process occurs again when the United States is in need of labor. Now it's important to understand this cycle because it occurs numerous times in the 20th century. Today's controversy over the Mexican immigrant is but a reflection of this historical cycle. It is not anything new, but it is a part of the experience for every generation of Mexicans, and every Mexican has had to face it. What we just encountered is the first cycle. Again, the first cycle of change in immigration policy. That whenever there are economic labor necessities in the United States, the remedy becomes Mexican migration. It stimulates a movement of people to the United States. When the labor needs are satisfied, there occurs an economic downturn, which results in immigration restriction and deportation. So this process occurs again when the United States is in need of labor. And we're going to see this cycle in future presentations because this cycle is continuous. And today's controversy is but a reflection of this historical cycle. Okay, thank you. That's the end of Unit 2. Please watch the film and read the chapter on the Mexican experiences to understand this cycle. And good luck with you on the writing assignments and the quiz. Thank you.